Recently, we had the OMG meeting in Reston, Virginia, and at that, the culmination of nearly 2 years' worth of effort to produce something along a business architecture standard came to fruition with the release of an RFP, so the process of formalizing a standard around a business architecture meta model has commenced. So I asked Nathaniel if I could do a quick, brief primer on this for the group, since this is the insider conference of note, to suggest this is what it might mean for you all down the road, either as practitioners or tool vendors. So the standard, what does it mean for BPM? So why is this a thing for anybody in this community to worry about? Well, one of it is that when we talk about what is a process, we probably all think we know what that means, but there's actually quite a variety of opinions on what that stands for. In terms of business architecture, the practitioners there also use the term process, but it's not exactly the same meaning, even with the variations within the BPM community. So in this case, we have two artifacts in particular in business architecture which are important. Something called a value stream, which is essentially one or more variations of the work done with Toyota in value stream mapping. So it dates back to that kind of characterization, although by now there's at least 3 or 4 different dialects about that. And what is a capability, which is essentially what is an organization capable of doing that supports a business objective, strategy, or other kind of organizational objective. So in this case, what in practice has been the problem space for me as a modeler has been that business architects essentially use value streams as a kind of super process. So the semantics of crossing from one perspective to the other create issues of granularity, because the abstraction in business architecture is much higher than what you get at in terms of BPM modeling. And what is a capability? Is a capability just a decomposed process structure just without the flow, right? So a node tree or some kind of box within a box motif. So the consistency of the artifacts and their meaning can be impacted if we have misunderstood or incomplete understandings of how one is to define these things from one realm to the next. And then different uses of the word process also can lead to inconsistencies in how this information crosses over from either the business architecture space to the BPM space or vice versa. So we have to talk about what is the relationship between a process that's understood in business architecture versus what is it understood in BPM. And in particular, an example of a heat map, a heat map being a particular rendering of either a value stream or a capability to indicate its health, where things are good, where things are bad, where things are at risk, and so on. What informs these typically are some manifestation of what is considered a business process and how that connects from the level of modeling we do in BPM up to the more abstract version that you see in business architecture is the challenge that is presented when you have competing versions of what process means. So one way of thinking about this is that the business model defines the sort of abstract perception of what the business is all about. So in this space, think of things like the Porter value chain. Think of things like the Osterwalder business model canvas. These are ways of describing the business model by which the organization generates value, creates revenue, has a reason for being. And so the definition here is from the source that's cited here, which obviously includes Osterwalder. So generally, there's agreement that value stream and capability as modeling artifacts should come out of this perspective. However, there's not necessarily a consistent set of interpretations of what value stream and capability mean. So the operating model is generally where this group tends to operate, no pun intended, right? We're talking about enabling and automating processes, refactoring them, re-engineering them, giving tooling support to the modeling of things and to the assessment and optimization of things. So we operate in this space, right? And generally we say BPM concepts should come out of this space. So our understanding of business process emerges from this sense of what is the perspective on the business at the operational level. However, there's actually not as much agreement on what is a process as one might think. So which of these purports to be in whole or in part a business process? This is from the BP Trends folks. This is what I mean when I say a value stream can be represented as a kind of super process. All you have to look at that is for a few minutes and you realize that there are some implied semantics there that are competing with something like BPMN semantics for explaining everything from flow to decomposition. And they're not necessarily compatible. What about this one? Everybody recognize this? This is a process classification framework from APQC. So this is the generic structure, right? You have to generally pay for the industry-specific models. But they have a way of decomposing this that's very interesting and very detailed. The one thing that's missing from this characterization, of course, is flow. And then, of course, we have a recognizable BPMN model. These are completely three different understandings of what a process is. So that's one of our challenges. Okay. I mean, it could be that processes are just a kind of container. And in truth, BPMN kind of treats them that way. So the answer is it depends on who you're asking. So one way of thinking about it is that the business model is something that's of interest to the senior management, and that's their focus. And when we talk about the line worker, they're much more closer to the ground. So they're either looking at something like a very detailed process model, or its narrative translation into something like standard operating procedures or work instructions. In between, we have where we tend to do our work with respect to line of business managers or supervisors that are, in some sense, process owners and therefore have something to say about how process execution should unfold, and therefore we need a model to depict what that looks like. So it's a kind of blending of what I call the what versus the how. And I'm not using this in the traditional Zachman framework sense. I'm just saying that how is a very specific and detailed description of what you're supposed to be doing. The what is more like abstract and more generalized. And somewhere in the middle, we have this transition from that level of abstraction and generalization to something more concrete and very detailed. And it's a little fuzzy. So from a modeling standpoint, the transition here is very difficult to define. So in the RFP press release that was announced, and this is what's here, right, we are presented with the challenge to create a business architecture core meta model standard by February 19th, 2018. Or that's, anyway, where the submissions are due, right? We'll have another year after that. The OMG does not move fast, for those who don't know how it works. So good 2 years from now, we would expect, under the best scenario, to have a business architecture standard. Now, why is this of particular interest to us? I'm going to go back to the themes from the beginning. So I've highlighted two of the objectives that are cited in the RFP. One is the fact that this is really for the business executives. And so for those of us who have tried to put a BPMN, even a simplified BPMN model, in front of a senior management executive who has the attention span of 5 minutes, we know how hard that can be. Anything that's detailed, anything that purports to get to the true underlying operational behavior of a business process has quickly exceeded the cognitive load of most senior executives. So one of the things the business architecture is trying to get at is a more abstract visualization, representation of this, and potentially a visualization of it, that is easier to consume and leave the mapping to the underlying details at the operational level to the practitioners. The other thing is, and that's at the bottom, I know it's hard to see, but is to facilitate the integration of multiple models of business, whether based on OMG standards or not. So there's, in that statement, an implicit desire for a connection to some of the key OMG standards, particularly the three that matter to us as a community: BPMN, CMMN, and DMMM. So this is what is known as the flower petal diagram. I'm not a big fan of this diagram, and it's been very controversial from its inception. I put it in there because it's in the RFP, so now it's in the public domain. I would concentrate less on what that actually suggests, as opposed to just thinking about what's in the middle. So capability is the core concept around which everything is going to be attached. And at the bottom, you see something called processes, decisions, and events. And so what I put in here is there's a definition of something called touch point. This is actually a breakthrough for the OMG, who has created at least half a dozen different meanings for the word activity in the various standards that exist. So we're actually trying to create a kind of umbrella perspective on this, through which we can translate the different perspectives into a single set of understandings. Capability, and the source for that definition is defined here, is from Holman and Ulrich, a business-oriented foundation for service orientation. So it's really just defined as a particular ability or capacity that a business has to do something to achieve a specific purpose or outcome. And that seems pretty straightforward, but capability is one of those terms, like activity, which will generate 3 opinions amongst 2 different people. So we have a challenge in trying to centralize on what this means, but as you see in the diagram, that's where we're going to start. The thing at the bottom, in highlight, again, since at the bottom not everybody can quite see it, is that these touch points will participate in how we map from the business architecture concepts, which remember are more abstract in general, to the more operational and detailed concepts expressed in BPMN, DMMM, and CMMN models. The visualization of this is essentially this diagram here. So we will be taking elements in the meta models for these three standards, amongst others, but I'm focusing on these three, right? And running them through this touchpoint mechanism, a to-be-created meta-modeling construct, which is unbeknownst and represents new ground with the OMG in terms of their MOF modeling, to the business architecture and back. So what will this mean for the process modeling community is that there will be an opportunity a couple of years from now to be able to think about their process models participating explicitly in a standards-based way with higher level concepts, which today is a very proprietary approach if the tools do it at all. So that's it. Any Q&A real quick, and then I'm going to hand it over to Denis. Yes, there.
BPDM, as we know, started off to do something very simple. In the end, it was killed by IBM because it involved rewriting UML.
Right.
Is that not going to happen, the same sort of thing happen with this?
I don't think so, and here's why. Because what has really, forgive me, has twisted the outcome of some of the more recent standards is the intercession of some of the major players who carry a great deal of market weight, particularly within the OMG membership. I think what's interesting about this effort is they're not there to play. The people here to play are the smaller EA, BA modeling vendors and a few BPMN vendors, you can see one in a few minutes, that are trying to create tooling to address this space. So no one has the market power to derail this individually, maybe collectively, but not individually. Now, on the other hand, this is going to make for a lot of Babel-like, Tower of Babel-like squabbles, but, you know, we have 2 years.
The short answer is Schroeder endorsed it. Schroeder endorsed it.
And that got it out the door. Honestly, it's been a rough 2 years to get this point. So again, you know, for some, this is not going to be particularly relevant, but for others, especially the process modelers, I would advocate that you follow this. And if you want to join in, you can reach out to me, or you can reach out to Denis, who sits on the same task force, to ask questions about it and where it might go. I think you'll see an example. You're going to show the capability model, right? Okay. So you're going to see an example of how a capability modeler can participate in the same modeling space as a BPMN modeling context, which would be otherwise understood as BPMN, DMN, or CMN. All right. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much